My name is Wil Torres, Director of Outreach here at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and I am so excited to be presenting Application Week. This started as a passion project, actually. Sometimes it's the small things and opportunities in your life that you're like, hey, you know what? I can do something about this. I identified a gap out there, kind of how I grew up, where I grew up. I didn't have a lot of understanding about what it meant to apply to college, let alone grad school. And it wasn't until I started working in admissions that I realized just how significant that gap could be for folks out there. And so rather than saying, hey, we're Stanford, come to learn about us, and then waiting to see whatever applications came in, I thought it was really important for us to say, hi, we're Stanford. We'd love to get to know you better, and here's how. And so the hope with Application Week and the different workshops that we offer is that we're able to provide some flexible toolkits, skill sets, exercises, and like frames of reference to help you understand how to approach the application and put your best foot forward. So it's one little step for equity, access, and opportunity, something that we really believe in here at the GSB. So moving forward, to get us on the same page, we're going to start with a little bit of a too long didn't watch. It's a spin on that acronym for too long didn't read, knowing that 50 minutes can be a big investment. And so right off the bat, letting you know what my big themes for today are for you. I do want to spend some time on the holistic review process that I think really underpins everything about the GSB evaluation process and really understanding how to position yourself to get in. I do love some good philosophies and frameworks. It's almost like that, teach a person to fish rather than just give them the fish itself. And so that's what I would love to do today with you as well. Get you in that mindset so you can ask some of those probing, interrogating questions that are actually going to be helpful to you beyond the application process and hopefully extend into some benefits in life overall. And then I do have some definite tactical, practical, as well as even more philosophical ways to think about how to maximize your time, regardless of if you're thinking about round 1, round 2, round 3, or even a future year. And then definitely incorporating live Q&A both throughout the day. And I just kind of did this because based on where my line of sight is, that's where my Q&A box is. But also spending some time at the end, making sure I'm able to tackle the themes and questions that you all have today. So one more time, the session goal is to start crafting that approach to help you put your best foot forward when applying to the GSB. Here we go. Preface, and I think this is really important. Even though I'm here under the auspices and as a representative of Stanford GSB, some of these things, some of the best practices, tips, and ways that we talk about them are from my own anecdotal experience, data point of one, and may not necessarily reflect the Stanford, like, here's how, as an institution, we might be framing things. And this is going to be like a lot of advice that's out there. I wouldn't be surprised if a good chunk of y'all have been on forums, been reading articles, been seeing things from folks, here's what got me in, or here's what you need to do to get in. How do you crack the code? Sometimes there's a nugget of truth in those, but also sometimes those nuggets of truth, those spin out into rumors, myths, and things that can actually set us back in the process. So as with any piece of advice out there, please take anything I have to say with a grain of salt. If there's something that you feel resonates with you, go ahead and make use of it. If there's something that you're like, you know what, maybe not today, save it in your back pocket. It might come in useful for tomorrow. Please don't feel obligated or pressured to kind of follow any of the pathways or advice that I have today, knowing that you don't need to have attended any of these events to be successful in the process. So everything with a grain of salt. All right, so the brief summary. Holistic review, again, I think is the key to understanding the process, and especially how we think about it at Stanford GSB. Our application is really big and beefy. If I wouldn't be surprised if you are already kind of in the throes of it as we speak, but really understanding how we use it is critical to thinking about, how might I position myself best so that, thinking about I'm not sending this application out into the ether, into a black box, but what do I want Wil to know about me? The next is honor your truth. I think too often, because of these markers that we see out there, some of the advice, even the class profiles that all of our schools publish, we start to think, hey, here's what the school wants. Here's an archetype that I need to be. And because of that, we start judging our journeys. Throw that out the window. I have no preconceived notions, expectations of who you are, where you should or should not be coming from, or what you should not, or possibly want to do in the future. Speak your truth. Every story is important. Every experience, identity, kind of thing that you have to bring to the table is something that is additive, something that other folks can learn from, and something that you all can build together. All right, the next thing. I do get questions about like what kinds of things are consistent across admits, or what makes for a successful applicant. That used to be a question that I used to shy away from because I didn't want folks to model or feel like you had to hang a couple of details on these 1 or 2 anecdotes that anybody could share. So I actually have a different answer these days. You all do stuff. And I think some of the folks who are able to articulate that, whether it's in the GSB process, applying to other schools, or even applying to jobs in the future, tell me about a time when. It's your lived experience, the things that you do. Those are the pieces of evidence that can help me when I'm in the admissions committee to advocate for why you should be coming to the GSB. So you do stuff. Tell me about it. What was it? How did you do it? What inspired those things? And ultimately, so what? The so what gets to some of that impact piece, what was possible next. And finally, I have a whole suite of application workshops already. These are from a few years ago. So you're going to see some similar themes, kind of pieces of advice, because a lot of those are evergreen. And they're really kind of additive to whatever part of the process you're in. Many of those workshops do have exercises and are much more engaging than I'm going to be today. I'll do a little bit more talking, but I also figured, why redo a resource that's already out there when I can add to it, provide some additional nuance, and sometimes it helps to talk about the same thing from different directions, just because the same way that there's many different learning pedagogies at the GSB, case study, role play, action learning. We all absorb and learn differently as well. And sometimes it's that one subtle shift that can help something click and help set you off on a path for success. So let's get going. So holistic review. And this, if anything, is hopefully what you take away from today. This is one of the key lessons that I've really come to embrace, and why I think the GSB evaluation process is both so valuable and also kind of explains why it's so long. So at a fundamental level, application review process, that holistic piece is, we take a look at everything that you submit to get a sense of who you are in the classroom and community. Okay, so what does that actually mean operationally for you? So key takeaways from here. We do not use a formula, there's no algorithm, and there's no equations to make admissions decisions. I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I think this is one in particular, if you're coming from a school setting or educational background where entry into programs did have some kind of, here's a minimum test score or whatever to shunt you into different directions. That is not the case at Stanford. So on that note, there are no benchmarks, there's no cutoffs, and there's no quotas. And I think that piece in particular becomes especially important later on. Things like industry, geography, gender, those are all context pieces. And you are so much more than any singular marker. So it also kind of doesn't make sense to have a particular quota per se, but rather I'm taking a look at who you are as an individual. I'm looking at what are the contextual pieces to help me understand what does achievement and excellence look like in your context. Because of that, no one piece of the application is more or less important than any other. And again, this is one we'll unpack some more today. And one more time, context matters. What someone does as a private equity associate might look very different from what somebody working in a nonprofit or in the education sector might look like. The opportunities, the types of projects, how impact manifests is going to look different if you're in England versus India versus the United States, for example. And so it doesn't really make sense to compare you to each other, but rather, how can I understand you given all of these markers and data points that help kind of paint that constellation of who you are? All right, so what do we look for in the process? 3 big buckets. So how you think, how you lead, and how you see the world. So interpreting this in a couple different ways, context is key. I'm going to keep coming back to that. So help me understand the world that you come from. If you also notice, these realms are industry, background, whatever, agnostic. The way you think, that can emerge in the classroom community, maybe it's at work. Whether you went to a school that is quote unquote perceived as prestigious or one that might be smaller or more regional does not matter in our process. Same thing for company. You don't need to have worked for a big name company. That is not going to look any more or less impressive than if you made an impact with your family business or starting your own venture. That said, that wow factor, that impact, those footprints that you've left behind also don't necessarily have to have come only from the work setting. Maybe there's clubs or organizations. Maybe you work multiple jobs to put yourself through college. These are all different ways to demonstrate that leadership element. And then how you see the world, again, by virtue of the diversity of thought, experience, we want you to come and speak your truth. Along those lines, oftentimes I get asked, what if I'm from a non-traditional background? Or what if I'm coming from a overrepresented kind of identity, background, experience? Throw those away. Those are actually not helpful kind of descriptors because again, I'm not admitting by country or by whatever, right? I'm looking at you as an individual. The one little asterisk caveat where I would say, maybe those can be helpful is if you approach it from a strengths-based approach. And if the way I asked it before, like, for someone from a non-traditional background, am I at a disadvantage? Turn that around, right? That's that deficit thinking kind of foundation. And oftentimes when we come from a deficit kind of thinking approach, we put limitation and bars around who we are and what's possible. Think of it this way. I'm coming from a non-traditional background, however you want to define that. Again, that's not kind of terminology that I use in the evaluation process, but quote unquote non-traditional, however you want to define that, that's a fresh perspective you bring to the table. Or if you're coming from a quote unquote overrepresented kind of background, whatever that means, parse that out. As you start thinking about these different experiences, if you're a consultant, how did you get to consulting? How did you grow up? What are some of those perspective pieces? The more you layer nuance onto those, all of these kind of notions and preconceived expectations about that start to fall away, and you start to embrace the fullness of who you are. And I think that is a really important tactical, practical, philosophical approach to this, is that no one is overrepresented. You are a single individual who brings a powerful worldview to the table. And next, show, don't tell. You're going to hear this kind of pretty frequently along the journey, but what does that even mean? Because like in an interview, I'm telling, this essay, I'm like telling, but kind of how do I show? So we will unpack that together as well. That's one of the phrases that kind of drives me crazy, because it's like, you can interpret that to mean so many different things. So what does that mean in this process? Okay, and I'm going to take a slight detour. I've already mentioned kind of leadership qualities, competencies in a few different ways. But again, what does that even mean? I think depending on where you are in the world, how we interpret, understand, and manifest leadership can look very different. The way that I was raised, right, looks very different from how I'm starting to really understand it now, knowing that as an admissions nerd, I've been doing a lot of research around this. But what is leadership? Where does it come from? What makes for an effective leader? And so to put a few more kind of posts around it for you to develop some buckets to start understanding what it could mean for you, I'm going to kind of approach and embrace and adapt an analogy our past dean, Kristen Moss, who was super influential in how I think about this, and someone I credit to my own personal development. So shout out Kristen Moss. We're still showing lots of love from the admissions office. An analogy that she used to share. So let's say there's something at hand. Let's say in this example, you need to get from the GSB, across campus, going to School of Engineering at Stanford. Maybe there's a class you're going to go take there. Maybe there's a faculty member that you are trying to meet up with to learn more about what they do. All right, here's an opportunity. Are you the person that comes up with the idea? So maybe you're like, aha, solar car. I mean, you could walk, you could take there's a free shuttle that'll take you across campus, but you know what? More power to you. Y'all are some ambitious people. So you want to build that solar car? Do it. And if you look, these are actually images from campus. The Hoover Tower, you can see on both sides. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of where you're going. And you actually do need to pass Memorial Church. You do walk along that to get from the GSB to the School of Engineering. So also trying to give you a few more data points of place. But back to my analogy, and now hopefully you can see where the inspiration for the title Detour came from. But are you the person who identifies the opportunity? Maybe there's that strategy that you're starting to develop of, okay, how can we address this? So in this case, like, let's build that solar car. Or are you the one who, that idea might not be your own, but you're rallying people to the cause. You're getting them on board, whether you have formal or informal authority around it, and you're building the community that'll help make this thing happen. Maybe you're the person actually building it. Maybe you're the one who's driving results. Okay, I'm gonna pretend y'all laughed at that, and if not, totally okay as well. But maybe you're the one who's actually in the weeds of things, making sure things are done. Maybe you're a really great planner, so you're developing some of these timelines and keeping people accountable to them, right? Because leadership comes in so many different ways, whether that's kind of your own accountability, that of others, that of organizations. Or maybe, you have all of these people on board, you're building the car. How do you know that people even know how to build a car? Maybe you're like me and you have no idea what the inner workings of it look like, but you want to help. Maybe you're the person training them. Maybe you're the one teaching them about photovoltaic cells, or here's how some of these networks work, and here's what the chassis looks like, so that when the time comes, people can work collaboratively and really to the best of their abilities to make this thing happen. Maybe you're creating the environment that allows people to shine. All of these are different lenses and different ways that you might demonstrate some leadership abilities. And even within each one of these realms, it can look different. And so really understanding, embracing at that fundamental level, how do you get stuff done? What were some of the actions you've taken? And how might that inspire kind of what comes next for you in the future? All right, so a few notes on the section. So I mentioned earlier that I do have a number of different application workshops already existing. So I'm not gonna do the exercises here, but the first one, navigating the application. If you search Google, search on YouTube, GSB navigating the application, my potato head is gonna pop up, and that's how you know you're at the right one. And I say that because there's a lot of stuff out there, like here's what got me in, and here's how to crack the code. I like to watch those sometimes, and sometimes I'm like, that's not how you do it. And working on the inside, I stand nothing to lose by like, I want you to put your best foot forward, because honestly, it also helps me when I'm reading applications to really elevate and identify kind of some of these leadership moments. So this workshop actually helps you understand how these different parts of the application work in dialogue with each other. Because even though they might look like different sections, kind of siloed, and as you approach it, you're like filling them out piece by piece, they actually do work in dialogue with each other to help me understand who you are. I have a sharing your story arc that actually covers a number of different pieces. So first, how do you start the story? What does that mean in the business school application context? How do you articulate things like what you do, where you come from, in both the written pieces, which I have another workshop coming up this week on, or verbally, right? Because that's another mode of communication that you're going to be using. And here I have it as an interview, but you can also extend that to networking, interacting with students or alumni in order to kind of figure out, is this experience right for me? And then also one on communicating your work history. This one's a little bit harder to find for some reason. So you actually have to go into YouTube and then search GSB communicating your work history. And then you'll find it. So, but here, workshop, too long, didn't watch, doing this again. And I'm gonna go section by section. Each piece works together to help me understand who you are. As I mentioned earlier, no one piece of the application is more or less important than the other, and evidence for our evaluation might come anywhere. So let's say, for example, you take the test. We accept the GMAT or the GRE, no preference, one or the other. If you're applying kind of round 2, you also have the option of taking the GMAT Focus or the newer version of the GRE. We have no preference one way or the other. So just putting that nugget out there. Not everybody's a test taker. A test is one day, few hours of your life. It by no means is a full picture of what your academic potential could look like. It's one potential measure, but it's not the only. So let's say I'm going to use quant, for example, because that's one I tend to hear a lot of concern about. I'll go to your transcript. And notice I say transcript and not GPA. GPA is a single data point. There's 3.0s, there's 4.0s, I've seen 100.0s. There's schools that have, they don't give letters or numbers. They send me a write-up for every single class you took. As an admissions reader, those are always fun. But rather, I'm taking a look at how you did in the context of your institution. Right? Whether it's the full 4 years, maybe you're at a school that is the 3-year equivalent of a 4-year bachelor's, totally okay, right? What classes have you taken? How have you done in them? Are there any themes here? Maybe you did take a lot of quant, stats, econ, calculus, whatever that looks like. Awesome, there's some evidence right there. Maybe you are an art history major. We definitely have them on campus. So maybe there isn't that big bulk of quant work. Maybe it comes out in your work history or your recommendations that you do a lot of analytical manipulation, data interpretation. And there have definitely been times where I've picked up the phone, said, hey, congratulations, welcome. You are an amazing individual, your impact, wow. And fully recognize that you don't have the biggest quant background. Here are some things to do to prepare so that you can hit the ground running once you're at the GSB. Using that example, like fully recognizing that evidence can come from anywhere, how you think, right? And the line does start to blur how you think, how you see the world. And so again, a really valuable element to understanding the holistic review process. So now let's get to some of that tactical practical that I've been promising, or the event title. But educational history, as I mentioned, I'm looking at your transcript. You need to submit a transcript if you've attended anywhere for at least a year or over. And it helps me understand what your academic background looks like. If you have graduate experience, submit that as well. It is not a plus or minus, but rather another lens and dimension that helps me understand kind of the perspective that you bring to campus. As for test scores, again, GMAT or GRE, either version, you do need to have testing to submit your application to the GSB. We do not take the executive assessment. As I mentioned, there's no minimums, no benchmarks, no cutoffs. There is no AI algorithm that sorts through and shunts them in different directions, exactly for the reason I just gave in the analogy. So the one time that there is a requirement, so if your transcript, if your educational history was done in a language other than English, you do need to take an English proficiency exam. That's the one piece there. Otherwise, once again, I'm taking test scores in the context of your entire application. All right, activities, personal information. Again, I have a workshop on that already existing, and we're going to do a little bit more there. So I'm going to gloss over that here. I have no preference for the things that you do, where you engage in. And as I mentioned, sometimes those leadership competencies might manifest in things like involvement in your mosque or synagogue. Maybe it's coming out in your personal and lived experience, doing the stuff that you love. All of them are equally valuable and educational for me in this process. Professional experience. You do not need to have any work experience to be admitted and enroll at the GSB. One more time, there is no minimum work experience requirement. The way to think about that is, given where you are in life, whether you are 15 years into your career, or maybe you are a current undergraduate student thinking about deferred enrollment, what kinds of footprints have you left behind? Knowing that someone 15 years into their career, the opportunities, your engagement will look different than someone who might not have held a traditional full-time role just yet. Also, how you categorize roles. I know sometimes when people do family business or have an internship that kind of straddles the line, it's actually a little bit less important how you categorize those things than telling me, okay, so what? What were those footprints? What did you do? What was the impact? So hopefully that's where you're starting to spend a little bit more of your energy in describing rather, instead of how do I categorize? And that so what is going to be what's helpful to me. Letters of reference, also putting in the plug, have a workshop on that coming up this week, both in terms of how you can understand it as an applicant, and then splitting it, the difference, so that I'm also providing some advice for recommenders. So if you don't know how to support recommenders, you aren't sure if they understand the process, this is something that you'll be able to share with them. At the highest level, we do require 2 letters of recommendation. One, preferably from a current direct supervisor. The reason for that is we ask all of our recommenders the same 2 questions. How has this person performed relative to equally qualified peers? And tell us about a time when there was feedback. We ask those prompts because those are the types of questions that help us get the information that's most useful to us. By that token, not everybody out there might be as familiar with writing a letter of recommendation. If they just respond to those prompts, they're doing the exact thing that and again, sourcing the types of detail that's helpful to us. We know this isn't possible for everyone. Maybe you have a new job. Let's say you are an entrepreneur, so you don't have a formal direct supervisor. Maybe your direct supervisor might not be your biggest advocate. Maybe there's promotions, raises, that hangs in the balance, never want to jeopardize those. It's as easy as there's a drop-down button with an explanation. So go to the next best person in your life who can answer those questions. We have a lot of trust in you to understand that nexus of people around you. And when I say best, they might give a superlative. So let's say first name that I see in the chat box, Hope is the best person I've ever worked with. Awesome. We kind of assume that you're great to begin with. What's even more helpful for me in the evaluation process is Hope is the best person I've worked with, and here's why. When they can provide details, some of those anecdotes, experiences, those are the pieces of information that are going to be helpful to me in the process. Essays, rather than going too deeply here, I am not grading essays. I am not rating if this is a good one or a bad one. If anything, these are lenses to help me understand your life better. What is that perspective you bring to the forefront? There's a lot of effort that we put into kind of the crafting of the words to make sure we're asking exactly the kind of question that we hope you're engaging with. So if in doubt, take a step back, answer the question. We'll have more on this. And again, I already have like at least 2 or 3 workshops out there specifically on writing writ large, as well as the what matters most to you and why essay. And I also want to say that might feel like one of the most pressure-packed pieces, but it's just one of many parts of the application. I can't think of a time where I've admitted or denied somebody solely because of their essays. There have definitely been times we've admitted people despite essays. So kind of hopefully that alleviates some of the anxiety and pressure there. Again, speak your truth. Anything that is listed as optional really is optional in the application. And so if in doubt, so what? If the takeaway is already somewhere in your application, you don't need to be repetitive. But if there's a new lens, even if it's something resume in your work history, something in your what matters most, but you're engaging from it a different direction, totally perfect time to use those optional spaces to help us get to learn about you more. And then the interview, these are about 45 minutes long, conducted by trained alumni. And I say that because they go through a lot of training to help guide you on the types of questions that, again, are going to be most helpful for me on the admissions committee front. They do not see your application. The only people who see your application are you, who you decide to share it with, and whoever's reading it. Interviewers will only see your resume. So think about this as approaching it from a blank slate. The vast majority of the questions are going to be behavioral based. So tell me about a time when. And as you think about the questions in the application, this is prep you've already been doing across the entire way. So hopefully this is a chance for you to just speak about them in ways, that allow you to relive and be proud about the progress, actions, and impact that you've made. All right, additional information. I do want to put a note here. Sometimes there is something in your life that isn't neatly captured elsewhere. So maybe there was a health emergency, or you had to take care of family members during college, so that impacted one of your semester grades. If it's not out somewhere in there, bullet point or two and the additional information, whether it's just a little bit of context to timeline of what happened, that's the perfect place to put it. It is not a place for extra essays, and I will not click on external links. So if it's important to you, it's important to us. But so what, right? If you're already not communicating it elsewhere, like why do you want to convey it? And what's the thing about it? I've gotten questions about, like, for some artists, like, is it possible for me to submit a portfolio? No need to do that. What's the so what there? What do you want me to learn about you? Because also I'm not an art evaluator. Plus art is subjective. So the GSB application is meaty enough. You don't need to add more to it. And we've designed it in a way such that we really are sourcing the information that's going to be most helpful to us. All right, so a few more pieces here to get us going. Some philosophies and frameworks. It all starts with you. This is the theme that emerges a lot. And this comes through the live your truth, speak your truth. People will often say, you need to be this, or you have to be that to get into Stanford. Not true. At some point, shut them all out. Even as you think about the questions we ask, I don't ask, what are your short-term, long-term goals? There's a smaller piece that says, what are your aspirations? I fully believe that if you are admitted to Stanford, if you're willing to put in the work, it might take a little bit of time, especially if it's a really big pivot, but it's totally possible. Right? And so I am not judging what your future aspirations are, how employable you may or may not be, or what the future job prospects look like on the outset. The bulk of my evaluation process is kind of, who are you? What have you done and how? A lot of that retrospective and some of that introspective piece. So rather than trying to model yourself about other people who have lived their truths, kind of lean in on yours. And as I mentioned earlier, the more you talk and embrace your story, that's the way to stand out in the process. It isn't to emulate or try to position yourself away from some preconceived notion of what a insert the blank here looks like, but rather it's stepping into your power, your story, your journey. And I know this process is stressful, and I fully acknowledge that, but in embracing the process, I think it helps shift the energy away from the output. So it's less about the essay of what matters most to you and why, and the process and interrogating, okay, here's that thing, but really, what's that why? Part of the philosophy there is like, there's actually a lot of research out there that feel free to look it up, that some of the most successful leaders are the ones who lead from a place of mission and purpose and values. What are yours? And so even in identifying that, maybe you decide not to apply to Stanford at all. Those could be insights that help drive essays to other places, or you'd be surprising how convincing and compelling a cover letter to a job might be if you're able to connect why you're applying to something meaningful for you. So even thinking about this process as, you know, a reflective opportunity that we don't often get in our lives. Now, past behavior as an indicator for future behavior. I wanted to underscore that one more time because that's where we get to that show, don't tell kind of perspective, or rather, I don't like to use the negatives in there. Show can be more powerful than tell. So it's not just the what, but the how, why, so what. Tell me about a time when can be one of the most helpful kind of frameworks for you to think about it. What are 2, 3, 4 things that you're proud of? Why? And again, ask yourself those questions, and those might be a good starting point for you to think about, okay, what do I want to put? And what do I want to tell Will about me? Sometimes it can be a little bit easier to think about a human on the other end of this, because I will be. Myself or one of my admissions team members, we are going to be the people on the receiving end. And so if it helps, what do I want them to know about me? It's not going into a box. There's no algorithm. We really are investing the time to get to know you. And also, one more time, if it's important to you, it's important to us. And I use that as a marker, especially thinking about things like activities. What should I put down? Or life experiences, the one I mentioned earlier of like, maybe there was a health emergency. It's important to helping me understand your journey. It's important to you. It shaped who you are. So please let us know in some way, shape, or form. Okay, now, there were a couple little tactical, practical pieces there, much more on the philosophical side, but I do want to get into a few more of the weeds here as well, especially as they pertain to the timelines. And these are actually questions that I got a lot of on the road. So hopefully this is a lightning round FAQ around that. So round 1, round 2, or round 3. If you are applying for direct enrollment, that means if you're applying to start the immediate following year, my recommendation is round 1 or round 2, no difference between the two. We do always admit people in round 3 for direct enrollment, but it tends to be a much smaller number because most of those seats have been taken by then. The exception would be if you're applying for deferred enrollment. So if you're a current college senior or in your final year of education, so that includes if you are in a coterminal master's or have gone into like a doctorate or master's degree straight through and you're in that final year, you can apply for deferred enrollment, which means you are admitted to a future class. You have 2 to 4 years to go get some professional experience, and you have a guaranteed spot in the class. In that instance, round 3 can work really well. It gives you more of your final year, and that's often when you have leadership opportunities, more time for impact, and because you're applying for that future year, we don't have the same type of seat consideration. The other consideration here in terms of timeline is if you're interested in the Knight Hennessy Scholars Program. So this is not a GSB piece, it's actually a pan-Stanford initiative that provides funding for 3 years of graduate study anywhere on Stanford's campus. And a lot of it is designed around the spirit of like, how do we bring people from different disciplines to address and take leadership on issues that matter to us. So lots of similarities there. It's a separate application process. And to be eligible for the Knight Hennessy Scholars Program, you do have to apply in round 1. That is a great segue to the consortium. If you're interested in applying to the Knight Hennessy program through the consortium, you need to apply to the early round. But let me back up, like what is the consortium? The consortium is a nonprofit organization that's dedicated to closing the severe underrepresentation of Black, Hispanic, and Native Americans in business and business leadership. So think about it in 2 ways. Once you're admitted and become a consortium member, there is a community of like-minded folks of all different backgrounds, all different interests, and different ways that you want to make impact who support that mission. Okay. Kind of a little bit more on the practical set for you, kind of in the immediate front. It is also an application pathway to the member schools. So think about it as a common application where there is a core, as well as supplements for the different schools, member schools that you might be interested in applying to. You can apply to up to 5 schools for $275 or an additional $25 for each school beyond that. The few criteria here is you do have to be a US citizen or permanent resident, and you need to have a demonstrated commitment to the consortium mission. There are no requirements or eligibility around identity. It's about that demonstrated commitment to the mission. For more information, definitely check out the consortium website, as well as the consortium events. So Consortium for Graduate Management Education. If you search Consortium MBA, it'll be the one that pops up. If you're interested in applying to dual and joint degrees, you can indicate that on either the GSB application, or if you're applying to the consortium application. Ultimately, there is no kind of benefit one way or the other applying via the GSB app versus the consortium app. If you look at them, the questions are going to be pretty much the same. The evaluation processes also the same. We're looking for the same types of how do you think, how you lead, how you see the world across all of our applicants, regardless of how they get to us. Okay. For those interested in dual and joint degrees, in either of those, you can just indicate that interest in which program, and there will be a prompt for how to apply for it. Let's say you're applying to the EIPER, the sustainability program. I don't see that essay. So if there are pieces that make sense, that overlap, totally makes sense, because that might be a reason for coming to Stanford, kind of speak to that prompt with that school in mind. And I promise I'm not trying to be like patronizing, but follow the directions. You'd be surprised at how many times people have approached me and said, well, can I do it this other way? So can I submit this third letter of recommendation? No need to do it. If anything, over time, we've identified, hey, here is kind of that balance of enough rich detail and opportunity for us to find the information that's helpful versus, more is not always more. So really understanding, let's be concise, and thinking about how to communicate succinctly is going to be a leadership challenge that you're going to be facing. So already another way of thinking about, all right, what matters most to me and why? Here's an opportunity for me to think about, how do I convey this piece of me, kind of using the guidelines and kind of posts available to me. And I'm a huge fan of questions. If you noticed here, I didn't say do this or do that. If anything, I'm trying to give you a roadmap and some guidelines for you to adapt this to share your story as an individual best. So if you could do anything, oops, sorry, my keyboard got a little bit away from me. If you could do anything, what would it be? Right? If you didn't have to worry about salary, geography, what other people thought about you, if you didn't have to think about whether or not you're qualified to do something, what would it be? Tell me about a time when. I know I've said this already iterated this, but hopefully that underscores just how valuable of a framework this could be. And if you don't know where to start, think of the STAR framework. And if you have kind of looked up, strategies for interviewing, STAR stands for situation, task, action, result. This can be a very helpful way to prepare not just for the interview, but what are some of the details that you want to convey in these examples and instances and anecdotes of your life? Remember, that show don't tell piece comes from anchoring in your lived experience. All right. And the questions that can be helpful for you to interrogate and dig deeper. What? How? It's not stated here, but why? So what? What are these takeaways? What's the impact and texture around this that you want me to know? And then one that can be incredibly useful and that will impact in our further workshops this week. Who are you? All right. Last couple tips, and then I promise I will jump to the Q&A box, some things to consider to maximize your time. So know the application. So go ahead and open any of the applications that you're interested in, any of the schools that you're applying to, click through all of them. Get a sense for what the questions are. And then that way you can strategize around, okay, which one do I think I'm going to need to invest the most time in? Which are the ones where I might be able to translate and transport themes across? By that same token, oh, here are things I really want to tell Will or the admission office at the other schools. Here are the spaces I can do that. And then kind of on the same kind of note, as you write for each school, my tip is write from scratch. Don't just completely copy paste. That way you can speak to the ethos and values of that school. Not to say that if you copy paste completely, it's better or worse, but you want to give yourself the chance to speak to that. And I know schools really value when you're able to articulate your why for that institution specifically. That said, I've definitely seen other schools' names in our applications before where you're like, oh, forgot to do some editing there. That's okay. Grain of salt, giving you as much grace because we totally understand this is a lot of work. And we want to make sure that we're understanding. Check in with yourself. This is the one, as we kind of go through this, and this is why I talked about the process. When are you most effective? Maybe you're a morning person. Maybe you're really good when you're running or walking or in motion, and that's when you do some of your best thinking. Reserve time to do that. Explore what that means for you. Sometimes along the process, you might hit a topic or you might hear something that you feel something, whether that's good, bad, confusion. Put a pause. Why? Where does that come from? And really understanding and unpacking that, that might be an area that could be of value for you to explore further, especially as you're thinking about like, hey, what is it that I want to do? Here's something that excites me, right? Even as you're thinking about the anecdotes, I know there's a lot of kind of mystery and rumor out there like, oh, you have to have something tragic or sad. It's not true. If there's a feeling, that could be the right thing because maybe it's something that you love and you love sharing with the world. Also, totally valid here. What do you need? Do you need editing support? Do you need someone to bounce ideas off of? Maybe when you sit down in front of a computer to type, you get writer's block, but you're great speaking. Okay, record yourself. Maybe record yourself on Zoom and have the transcription do the job for you, right? Still your words, still your experiences. But leading up to that top piece, when are you most effective? Let's figure out what some of these roadblocks might be to push you on that route. Because those are still going to be some of those life skills that are also going to be extremely valuable for you, regardless of what happens through this process. And then what's a realistic timeline for you? Maybe you want to take or retake testing. As I mentioned, between round 1, round 2, no difference. Tests are valid for 5 years. So maybe you just want to knock it out of the way now and not have to worry about that in a future year. Each one of you has a different timeline and reality based on work schedules, family, personal circumstances. Take that into account and spend a little bit of time plotting through that. Also recognizing, I know people who are super effective at the last minute, totally okay as well, as long as you understand that. You know what? Eyes wide open. Identify a support network. Whether there are other people applying, maybe they're friends who can just bounce ideas off of. You might be applying to business school, but you don't have to go on this journey alone. And having these people can be the ones who can help you through some of the tough times. Think, read, write. So, and lower the stakes. If you start with a what matters most and why essay, it just feels like a big question, big stakes attached to it. So what matters to you? Start on these subsets. Maybe get a journal or one of those apps that give you a daily prompt. Start putting your words onto paper. That is the best way to start getting more and more comfortable articulating the things that kind of are important to you. If you don't practice, you don't know what the words could be. And sometimes there's a feeling or thing that you know the truth of as a visceral piece of who you are, but finding the right words can be hard. So practice that. And honestly, life is messy. Feelings, experiences, emotions can be very textured. And sometimes imperfect is totally okay as well. But you won't know until you start to practice. And if in doubt, I fully recognize one more time that this is a stressful process. So I'm going to close this out on a little bit of a happier note, a little bit of the way I approach life. During the tough times, just know that I and Helen, this is Helen, believe in you. You got this. So I'm going to let you take a look at Helen's smiling face for one more moment. I'm going to stop sharing screen and I am going to jump into the Q&A box. I'm going to prioritize questions that either have an upvote, so I have these sorted by most upvotes, or topics that I have not already covered over the course of this workshop. And if there's a future workshop or another resource that I think might be helpful for that, I'll make sure to articulate that as well. So let's turn it over to the Q&A box and you own the process. So consider each GRE test separately, or do you calculate a super test score if you have taken it multiple times? Great question, Taha. I am concerned with your highest sitting, your single sitting. That said, if you've taken multiple tests, let us know. But really, I'm most concerned about that single sitting. Aditi, so this is a question about presenting options for short-term goals. Honestly, as long as it's convincing to you, it's convincing to us. And part of this is that I'm not rating, again, what your goal should or should not be, how realistic these things are. And 3/4 of you will probably change something during your time at the GSB. And I am never going to hold you to account for what you wrote as your inspiration or motivation for business school. New opportunities out there, awesome. As long as you're able to articulate why business school makes sense to you, you're doing the right thing. All right. How many people are generally considered from round 2? I don't feel confident writing my GRE before the 12th. Totally okay. And so the way we think about it is like, we've been doing this for a lot of years. I've been in admissions for over a decade, and so have many of my teammates, collectively way over a century of experience in this space. We have a pretty good sense of who we want to admit in round 1. Awesome. There are folks that we know are really strong and have potential. But we want to know what the entire applicant pool looks like. So we'll waitlist some folks and bring them over to round 2. In round 2, same process. We'll take a look at the folks who've been waitlisted and admit the folks that were like, hey, congratulations, we'd love to have you on campus. So it's less about trying to strategize a numbers game and more about, okay, when do you feel best about your application? So hopefully that puts a little bit more context on the approach and the way to think about that. Vabav, application fee waivers. If you email our office, we are running a pilot fee waiver program, so we can learn much more about the kind of context and what's happening out in the world. So email us, and we can help out on that process and how to apply for one. All right, continuing to power through here. Letters of recommendation earlier I mentioned, and I will have a full-on workshop just on this because letters of recommendation is actually one of the themes I got some of the most questions this past year. So that one is coming up later on this week. All right. Mentioned the fee waiver already. Email our office and we can provide the instructions for how to move forward with that. Can you submit a round one application without the GRE score? You do need to have a completed test score by the time you apply. Question from Lynn about, will somebody be typically from the same region or country on interviews? So typically, interviews are going to be virtual. And so I actually think this is a great benefit to applicants because if you've ever had to run across town, try to find a space, you hit traffic, you're already kind of a little unsettled. So with virtual, you're already in a setting you feel comfortable with, and knowing kind of our familiarity with the virtual world, I think that really sets you up for success there. And rather than having someone just locally, now we have a whole range of folks who maybe they have a shared interest or these other elements of commonality to help the conversation flow. But I do think it also leaves a lot of opportunity in terms of scheduling. So, and I've seen some wonderful, beautiful write-ups through this online process. So kind of that's where it's coming from. Typically, we try to have someone within your time zones as well to make scheduling easier. So again, they're all deeply trained alumni. Okay, all right. Not using descriptors like non-traditional, underrepresented. When those factors are in the context and heavily of how I think, lead, and see the world. Beautiful. If often informs why you want an MBA, are there other resources to provide clarity on what you mean by strengths-based approach? I love this question, India, and I think this is something that I will tag a lot on Friday's session on kind of stepping into your power. And a couple of nuggets here. There's some really beautiful research about things like social capital, cultural capital. Tara Yasso, Y-O-S-S-O, has some really cool research on community cultural wealth. And even though it kind of frames it in kind of identity-based kind of philosophy there, you can expand that kind of framework, and that's kind of the beauty of theories and framework. You can expand that to understand the range of your lived experience as a source of power and perspective. And so again, talk a little bit more about that later, but you have a powerful kind of, you have a lot to add. Honor that. Okay, last few, because I honor that we are already over time. So thank you for those who have stuck on. For everybody else, we will be recording this and posting this shortly. It might take a few days while I edit, so likely early next week. But a couple quick lightning rounds here. We do have people with advanced degrees, previous masters, PhDs. So the answer is yes. That is another lens that you bring to the table. Let's see. All right, some really great questions here. We did answer throughout this. If you don't get admitted in round one, is your application rolled over? No, unfortunately, we try our best to render the decision. And so if you're not admitted, you won't be able to apply again to the next year. All right. It seems like as I'm scrolling through some of these, hopefully we've been able to capture over the course of today. I'll go back through as well after this event and try to incorporate anything that I've missed over the course of this week. One more time, thank you so much. Oh wait, actually there's one more here before I jump off, and I think this is a great one. For reapplicants, I'm taking a look at your application in the context of the here and now. I'm not comparing your application to a past one, what's different, what's something they could have done better or differently. That is not a piece of my evaluation. I'm trying to understand who you are in the here and now. So tip there, start the essays from scratch again. Even if the themes are the same, which would make sense, especially if you're digging deeply, there might be new kind of experiences or frameworks or words that you use to explore that. Maybe you do have a new interest. Allow yourself the opportunity to let those learnings and the you emerge, and don't hinge too much on who you were before. I care about that person who's going to be joining us today. So thank you for catching me on that one, Albertine. That was a great question. One more time, thank you so much for joining us. Hopefully you've pulled some helpful nuggets here. There are a number of different GSB application workshops with exercises to push you to and through and nudge you around, along some of these ways. So if you do get writer's block, we already get some stuff to support you. So thank you again. Hopefully I'll see you across the week and we'll be able to engage again soon. Coming from me, from Helen, from that slide, you got this. I believe in you. Take care.